Hello, students of world history. Today's Renaissance lecture is the beginning of Unit 8, Part 1. We're talking about the Italian Renaissance today, and the Italian Renaissance starts in the northern part of Italy. Italy is not yet a country. Italy is a bunch of different city-states. And we're talking about the period around 1400 or so. And this part of Europe is starting to get wealth from the spice trade. Spices coming from Asia, spices coming from the Middle East are traded along the Silk Roads. It is Italian merchants who are picking up these spices from the Ottoman Empire and bringing them into Europe and making a tremendous amount of money from that. In addition, around 1350 or so, there was a Black Plague, if you remember, and this plague kills off about a third of the people in Europe, including a third of the people in the northern part of Italy. If you kill off a third of those people, their property, their wealth is going to their relatives or to family members. And so imagine that people in all over the place are getting a third wealthier from the death of all of these people. Black Death is a tragedy for many, but for those who survive, it is an increase in their wealth. There are a number of city-states in this part of the world, and city-states are urban places that are concentrations of wealth, and more civilized, let's say, more complex than what you might have in the countryside, where you just might have a bunch of peasants working for a local aristocrat or lord. In fact, there are a number of really great, very powerful, very wealthy families. They become the patrons of the Renaissance, so the people who kind of pay for the Renaissance and push the Renaissance forward. Probably the most famous of these families is the Medici family in Florence. And Florence is the city where you have kind of the birthplace of the Renaissance. I think we have a dog in the building. Anyway, the Renaissance is a rebirth of Greek and Roman culture. The Greeks, if you remember from first semester, had a tremendous civilization, tremendous culture, a lot of philosophy and so on. And then we also have Roman culture, which also built up an incredibly large empire and very impressive state. Well, with the Germanic barbarian invasions in the 5th century, around the 400s, you had the demise of Roman culture and the end of Roman culture and all the great things that went along with it. And then we had about 1,000 years of the Dark Ages, where really nothing much went on. There wasn't really very good government, or there wasn't really very stable empires or anything like that within Europe. Going along with the Renaissance is this idea of humanism. People during the Dark Ages or during the Middle Ages really just focused on God. They focused on getting into heaven. They were afraid to show off their talents. They were afraid to kind of be somebody. They just wanted to give credit for anything that happened to God and get into heaven. Now we start to see during the Renaissance a focus on human potential and human achievements, rather than just thinking that God is responsible for everything and letting him take credit for it. People wanted to start to take credit for their talents. They wanted to show off their talents. They wanted to become famous. They wanted to enjoy their wealth. Previously, if you had a bunch of money, something was wrong with you because according to Christianity, you should give your wealth away if you've got it and share it with others. And now people are starting at this point in time with the Renaissance to think differently. Now, this is all very sinful. This is all stuff that can drive you into hell in the medieval way of thinking. But there's this new way of thinking that the Romans did it, the Greeks did it, they knew how to live. We should be like the Greeks, we should be like the Romans at this point in time. And so they start to study the same kinds of things that the Romans and the Greeks study. They start to study rhetoric or speech making. They start to study non-Christian morals. They start to study history, find out what great people of the past did. And they start to study a pure Latin language and then also the Greek language in order to get at the real ideas of Romans and Greeks. They do these things, they study these things, they start to want to explore how great they can be themselves in order to do things like run a city-state or to run a business. These are things that you find, in these Italian city-states. Once again, the Medici family is a prime example of this. They run both the city of Florence And they also run a bank that is present in many parts of Europe. So they're fabulously wealthy and fabulously powerful. The ideal Renaissance man or ideal Renaissance woman are basically people who can do anything. They have all of these talents and they can show them off. And when they do show them off, it's not something that makes it seem like they are, pushing it or that they're trying really hard. They like to show off their talents and make things seem really effortless. We see this revolution in the way people are continuing in art, and there is a revolution in art at this point in time. Renaissance art is really based on realism, both in painting and also in sculpture. The art that is being created looks much more real than the art of the medieval period. I'll show you that in a lecture tomorrow, how there's a huge difference in the quality of painting and the quality of sculpture between the two periods of time. You might have heard of some of these famous artists from the Renaissance. A lot of them are Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Michelangelo and Donatello and Raphael and Leonardo da Vinci. Like I said, we'll look at some of their works tomorrow. Now, these are individual people who are being paid by patrons, people like the Medici family, to create these great works of art. They are sought after, they are famous. And once again, much more about art tomorrow. There is a revolution in literature as well. People start to write about personal subjects and politics rather than just writing about religion, which is really the main thing that those few people who were writing in the medieval period were writing about. They're writing about how to get into heaven and religion and God and Jesus, all these Christian things. Now people start to say, well, the Romans and the Greeks weren't obsessed with that. We're going to be obsessed with ourselves. We're going to be, writing about the human condition rather than what God would want and so on. They start to use vernacular languages. They start to use, instead of Latin, which is the language of the church and also the language of educated people for hundreds and hundreds of years, they start to use languages like Spanish or French or English or German in their own countries. Now they do this because I think that these are languages that people speak, amongst themselves. It's maybe easier to transmit ideas. Maybe it makes it for a broader audience. Very few people actually understand Latin. Lots of people in France understand French. It makes more sense to write about people in their own language. And so you get people like a guy by the name of Petrarch, who writes about famous Roman generals and statesmen and so on, and talks about how great they were, and maybe we could be more like them. Or a guy like Boccaccio, who writes a story about 10 people telling 10 stories to each other during an outbreak of the plague. These are just normal people, kind of normal rich people, who are fleeing the plague, and their lives with their loves and humor and all those sorts of things. Once again, it would be stuff that you and I would like to read, but for medieval people, they wouldn't understand why you would write about normal people. Normal people weren't important before the Renaissance. And then Machiavelli, you might have heard of Machiavelli, writes a book about how to be a ruler, how to be a prince, or how to be a person who could take over one of these city-states in Italy and run it. And doing so not in a godlike way, not in a Christian way, but really in kind of a sneaky, nasty way. There's also a northern Renaissance that goes beyond Italy. You can imagine that cultural diffusion happens, and the rest of Europe finds out that the Italians are doing something special, that they have these new ideas, that their art movements are becoming filled with a new kind of quality, that their books are now about people. And as it spreads to other parts of Europe, they start to maybe be a little bit less selfish, and they start to think not just about how they could improve themselves and how they could show off their talents and be famous, but in the rest of Europe, in England, for example, or in parts of France and Germany, they start to try to talk about how human beings could improve society and not waiting around for the end of time and for Jesus to come back and more of a religious idea about how society is going to eventually get better. They want to try to, as human beings, make society better. This is also what we call the Elizabethan age in England. And I'm sure you've heard of William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare is part of this Northern Renaissance, kind of later, a little bit later, but he writes about the human condition, about lives, about loves, about leaders, good leaders and bad leaders, and he tries to give kind of moral examples for people, what to do and what not to do as a human being, as part of humanism. Well, a tremendous boost to this idea of Renaissance ideals and humanism, and then pretty much for hundreds and hundreds of years after this, we have ideas being spread by the newly created printing press, something that comes around 1440, 1450 or so, invented by a guy by the name of Gutenberg. And um, being able to make copies of books that are written by hand, they're manuscripts, being able to make printed books and multiply them by the hundreds or the thousands really spreads the idea of humanism, spreads the idea of the Renaissance. People can read about the changes in art and read from literature this new way of talking about human beings. And then it expands to things like being able to make books that contain all of the laws of a particular kingdom, or maps of the New World, or maps of explorations and charts and so on. This allows more people who are wealthy, more people who live in cities to read, to study, and it's making just a lot more people literate, or making it available that more people can read and write. Humanism starts off with a very small number of people, but it starts to spread throughout Europe and eventually to the rest of the world. And it changes how people view life and how life should be lived. Instead of just living the best life possible that God would want, people start to live kind of in the here and now and live in a more pleasurable way, once again, to kind of show off their talents and wealth and so on. Political structures and religious practices also begin to be questioned as people start to think a little bit for themselves and think, well, why is it that the king has all the power? Or why is it that the lords have all the power? Why is it that we just listen to the pope? Why do we have to, do what the church says? People start to question, and eventually political structures and religious practices will be changed, as you'll see going forward in this unit. Well, I hope I got to all of the EQs. I'd like you to take your lecture quiz, and if you have any questions for me, certainly send me an email or let me know, and I can answer your questions. Thanks so much. Have a great day.